Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are glad you are here. We know that some folks are going to continue trickling in, but we want to get started because we've got a lot to get to today. My name is Rebecca Ehrlichman Bloom. I'm the Assistant Dean for Advancement and Engagement at the Evans School, and I am very pleased to welcome you to the continuation of our Evans School Dean's Forum on Race and Public Policy series. Today's conversation will be about leading and managing anti-racist organizations. There are many of us here today, so we are going to welcome you into this space and give you a moment to welcome each other into this space by typing into the chat, if you're able, your name, your connection to the Evans School or the UW, if you have any, and a reason why you have chosen to spend time with us and with each other in conversation today. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to type in to the chat your name, if you have a connection to the Evans School or the University of Washington, and a reason why you have chosen to spend time together in community with us this afternoon. So I'll give you a second. While you continue to do that, and we do encourage you to do that, I often think if we were in a room together, we'd be looking around and welcoming each other. So we'll try and do that in the Zoom setting. I get the pleasure of introducing Dean Jody Sanford, who will lead us into our program today. So Jody joined the Evans School nearly exactly 3 months ago. And I think it's safe to say that she has made good use of those 3 months. She has led the school through a really thoughtful and important process to examine and re-examine our mission, vision, values, and purpose as an educational institution. I think she's going to tell you a little bit more about that process, and we'll share with you in the chat here a link to where you can see what came from that process. But in doing so, she has set the Evans School, has helped us chart a new path and set us aiming towards something that I think is going to be incredibly fruitful for both the Evans School and the wider community in terms of living into our values of being an anti-racist organization. So I'm very excited to welcome her here. Jody, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. So I want to do just a little framing before I introduce my friend and colleague, Susan Gooden, who's going to help seed our longer program today. But I want to start by really acknowledging the space that we are all on. There's the ancestral lands and the present day life of Indigenous people. In particular, in Seattle, we want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish tribe, who are still unrecognized by the US federal government, and their lands are the ones upon which we study and work at the University of Washington. Right now, I'm actually on a land where the people called Sioux and Dakota lived in the middle of the country in what the US government calls Minnesota. So if you're unsure about who were the first peoples in the land that you are currently on, we'll share a link in the chat, which is a great place to start your own self-study. It has maps and names of the land, and it's quite interesting. We also want to acknowledge that the country wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the forced and enslaved labor of Black people. So we also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life stolen due to white supremacy and violence that's still continuous and rampant today. So as Rebecca said, the Evans School is really committed to learning about our role in colonialism and racism and actively reviewing our internal systems, policies, and procedures through an anti-racist lens. And we're also committed to hosting that kind of learning for others. As Rebecca said, we've just completed a community dialogue about our purpose, our mission, vision of where we're going and the values that are going to take us there. And coming out of small group conversations with 140 people and a community retreat, we were clear that our core purpose is to inspire public service and democratize public policy. We are grounded in our core values of equity and courage and service. And we do that work by educating leaders, by generating knowledge and hosting communications to co-create solutions. And so this program is one of our new activities. Interim Dean Allison Cullum and I wanted to use the convening power of the Evans School to focus attention on the ways that public policy in its creation and implementation have reflected racial assumptions and perpetuated inequity, and the ways that policy and implementation can be used by leaders to address these historical legacies in the United States and get us closer to the democracy that we need and that we deserve. So when I was thinking about what's the topic of this forum that I wanted to call, I'm an organizational scientist. And so I really wanted to focus my first conversation on the organizations that implement public policy, that make policies of their own, that dictate how people are together in the context of work. And I wanted to be able to host people. And so today what we're doing is not just having some talking heads. We actually have two segments in this program. One is a conversation between Susan Gooden and myself, which I'll introduce in a minute. And we'll be doing that until about 1:30. Is that right, Rebecca? 1:30? Yeah. I'm getting my
Remember,
best
you have to
on.
remember you're in Minnesota, so
I
it's
know.
12:30 here.
So we're going to start the first part, and then we will, at 1 o'clock, start into the second part, which is to invite people to step into their own explorations of how the ideas that Susan and I are planting show up for you as a leader, as a manager, because I'm a teacher at my core, and taking time to apply ideas are going to be helpful for you to grow and be part of making the change that's in front of us. So now to Susan. When I thought about an expert, particularly somebody who understands the legacies of race in public administration, my mind went immediately to Susan. She's a colleague and a friend. She's also a dean and professor at the Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. She's written prolifically in this space, and we're sharing some links to her work, a recent book on global equity in public administration, a book on race and social equity, where she names that this is a nervous area for government, and some work on cultural competencies for public administrators. She's also the past president of the American Society for Public Administration. She's a Fulbright scholar and a colleague of mine in the National Academy of Public Administration. So I'm going to invite her to come, I guess, into the space with me. People who know much more about this than me are going to make that happen. As that's happening, I was realizing when I was preparing for today that we're going to be talking about leading and managing anti-racist organizations really with three parts of ourselves, right? So both she and I lead organizations. So we're committed, both of us, to trying to lead and manage anti-racist higher education institutions. We're also scholars of organizations and systems, management and leadership. And the third dimension of this is, as teachers, we have a responsibility to educate the next generation of people who are going to be prepared to redesign institutions and what I hope deliver more public value, right? More effectiveness, more social equity. So I think as leaders, as scholars, and as teachers and trainers of the next generation, that's all going to inform our conversation. Right, Susan?
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, Jody. Thank you for the opportunity.
So I want to ask you a question to start. There's all this terminology being thrown around these days. And Evans School is using explicitly anti-racism, but as you know, there's been a lot of conversations throughout time about equitable or diverse organizations. How do you make sense of this terminology?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dean Sanford, for including me. And I commend you on this excellent series that you are hosting through the Evans School, certainly a very highly respected school of government. And I'm delighted that we're able to have sort of this West Coast, East Coast discussion. This is great. I was looking through the chat and I see a number of colleagues and folks from the East Coast. And so it's great that one of the great things about Zoom is that you literally can get people together from everywhere. So I appreciate that. You know, when I think about anti-racism versus more generic concepts such as diversity or equity and inclusion, I think they all have a place in the lexicon of the work that we're doing. But I think the choice of words that we use really depends upon what it is that we're intending to do. And so when I think about broader concepts like equity, equity encompasses a lot of things, as it should. Racial equity, gender equity. There are, the able-bodied versus those who are differently abled. It encompasses a lot of dimensions. And that's why I said in my book, race and social equity is a nervous area of government, not the nervous area of government, because there are other nervous areas as well, right? However, when we think about anti-racism, then we are putting more specificity onto the conversation. And when I think back to the Race and Social Justice Initiative, when it first got its start under Mayor Nichols in Seattle back in the early 2000s, I remember interviewing him for a chapter of the book, and I asked him, why did he name it the Race and Social Justice Initiative instead of the Equity Initiative or the Diversity Initiative? And he said, he felt that race and social justice was a harder name. And he said that his experience had been that oftentimes when you convene groups and you start talking about concepts like equity or diversity, that people will steer away from the conversation if the frame allows them to do so. But he said, if I started the initiative and had race as the first word, then that says that this is where the conversation starts and this is the focus for the conversation. So fast forwarding, when we are using the term anti-racist or anti-racism, we are being very specific about the work that we are doing. And I think, and certainly Professor Kende, whose work on how to be an anti-racist, just yesterday, ASPA had a plenary session, and I had an opportunity to moderate a discussion with him. And, I respect his work tremendously. And I think that whole notion that, being race neutral is actually being racist. And I think we have to take a moment to sort of grapple with that. The default is, for many of the reasons that we know, the historical inequities and all that, the default is that racism will continue to occur unless we're very intentional about dismantling it. So I think about it as like anti-aging products. The aging process is going to occur unless we try to do something to try to hold it off or reverse it. The same thing with anti-racism, that if we don't intentionally do something, then racism and racist policies will continue because that is the default. And that's been what's baked into our system. Those, whether we're looking at environmental policies, criminal justice policies, health policies, we see those segments. And so that's why anti-racism is much more specific in terms of our intentionality and our focus.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Susan. I have to say, in my own life as a white woman, part of it was realizing how, we have these incredible diverse, disparate outcomes in public policy, right? I'm a social policy person in education and poverty and child welfare. And I think I kind of normalized that those racial disparities were going to exist. Mm-hmm. And about a decade ago, I thought, why? Why is that acceptable? There must be something in the operation of the system, right, that's perpetuating this. And I think about higher education and how part of what I learned when I went to college is you just have to adapt to the way the system is set up, right? Well, that system was set up by white people according to those norms, and the white people don't have to adjust as much as other people need to adjust. And so to me, I also have been very influenced by Kendi's work. He is very clear. Everybody has read, many people have read his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, but his other book, Stamped from the Beginning.
Yes, his earlier work. Yeah.
Right. It's brilliant because it shows how there are these three streams through the history of our country between racists, segregationists, people who wanted separate, people who are like, no, we'll assimilate Black people, make them more like white people, and then anti-racists who are doing what you suggest. And that these three streams, right, have been pushing against each other and being in dialogue. And I think, at least for us, we're using anti-racist very intentionally.
And I think it's, even if we go back to, excuse me, I think you're making an excellent point, Jody. Excuse me. But, I think even if we think back to this historical analysis that you speak of, and we think back to public policy and some of its early, and we think about slavery. Okay, it was legal to do everything to a slave, almost, except one thing. So you could kill a slave, you could rape a slave, you could punish a slave, lynch a slave, all those things could be done. The one thing you could not do, that even whites could not do legally, was educate a slave. So the fact that that was the one thing that, as a society, leaders in the society said, that is the biggest threat. It is illegal to educate a slave. And even whites were punished for that. So that goes to show you the extent to which the power of education, the power of knowledge, the extent to which the racism was ingrained in policies, into the development of policies, and that we see the manifestation and the legacy of some of the things that we see now. All these things set up the stage for the things that we're seeing now in terms of the criminal justice inequities and why these things are viewed as, well, maybe it's still questionable here. All of these things have that historical context. And I think for all of us in the organizations that we lead, understanding that historical context is important. I see one of my colleagues, Bill Leidy, is on, and he has many, many years in state service, used to be chief of staff for 2 former governors. And he worked a lot with the Virginia retirement system. He talked about, under his tenure, when they discovered the retirement benefits, that there were sort of, 2 systems. There were inequities in terms of, built into the system, in terms of benefits for Blacks and benefits for whites baked in. And so one of the things that they did was to sort of dismantle those policies. But all organizations have a history, have a historical record, and all government organizations have a historical record. And I think the first place for all of us to start is to really take the time to understand, what is the history of our own organization that we work in? What are some of the policies? What were some of the sort of the top racist policies that were part of our organization's history? And what do we see as the vestiges of those policies in terms of our policies today, and the long-term effects and the long-term implications? So that historical piece is huge.
Today, Susan, part of why I wanted to invite you to this circle is because of your expertise in management and leadership, right? And so I want to talk just a second about how our own identities as leaders, how are you experiencing it as being a resource to this work of anti-racism?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's this old Indian proverb that says, only the wearer knows where the shoe pinches, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is really important to keep in mind. At the same time, so certainly as my identity, I'm an African-American female. I grew up in a rural area. I think those identities are important, native born US, of course, those I grew up in the South, of course, those identities are going to be important as a part of who I am. And everyone on the Zoom link could be able to, identify and talk about some of the areas that resonate with them based on their identities or the area in which they were raised. But what I will say is that although it does inform, because directly what microaggressions are or what they feel like or what those experiences are, and you pick up on them and you see them and you can quickly identify them. The one thing I think it's always important to know is that everyone can make a contribution. And here I think about it as if we think about fluency in a language, just because I'm not a native Spanish speaker, for example, doesn't mean that, and that my accent will always be detected, doesn't mean that I can't communicate on some level, and doesn't mean that that communication is not going to be appreciated. So one of the things that I will say is I'm not from the camp that only African Americans can advance racial equity, or only racial minorities can advance racial equity, or only American Indians can advance racial equity. These are shared responsibilities. These are community responsibilities. We can each contribute and make important contributions in very different ways. So even though we may not have worn the shoe of racism directly, we know what that experience is like, or we can get a sense of what that experience is like through second and third hand information. There's a lot of information out there. So I think it really comes down to what is our will? What is our political will? And one of the things I've been most impressed about during the pandemic, it really showed how quickly we can pivot as a society and do things completely differently when there's will, right? A number of the things that we've done in terms of, online education, how many folks said, oh no, this is, the kiss of death, we can never teach online, all this, all of a sudden, we have a pandemic and we pivot to that space, and we pivot to that space effectively. Was it perfect? No, but we had the will to do so. And certainly I don't think anyone would argue that we haven't come a long way from where we were. So whatever those changes are, if we have the will to do those things, I look at the places now that you can go and, you pick up your goods and have them delivered and put in the back of your car, the trunk of your car. How many people who were disabled wanted that for years and advocated for that for years? No, it's going to cost too much and we can't do it because of reason XYZ. Now, it's easily done. So my concern here is that we've had a lot of silver linings during the pandemic that I don't think that we have fully recognized and given ourselves credit for, like the removal of standardized tests as a condition of admission to many universities, because it was impractical, right? You couldn't do it. And so a lot of them were dismantled or paused. Do we need to go back to that? Or given the information that we know about standardized tests, is this the time that we take advantage of that silver lining and end a racist practice and policy? So, there are opportunities everywhere. And I think some of the silver linings of the pandemic, we should be very intentional about extending.
I agree. I love your examples. I think it's interesting to me about how identity really shapes things, right? So as a white woman raised in the Midwest, my awareness of race is very different, right? So I don't think I grew up being aware of microaggressions. I know I didn't. And in fact, I come from a community where culturally to talk about race is to be racist. Mm-hmm. And it was only in college, right? We talk about education, when I began to understand the history and the legacy and the difference between what I may have intended and the impact that I was having on other people. This last fall, I did a leadership program that was convened by the Squamish Nation. And I loved it because it was Enough Leadership Program, which in their language means figuring it out leadership society. And I feel like for white people, sometimes we just have to be willing to learn in public and consent. People actually, when I talked about having this session, the first reaction of a few people was like, the Evans School can't do this because we aren't that. We aren't an anti-racist organization. And I said, no, but I don't think there are many anti-racist organizations right now. And part of what we need to do is try to learn in public. In that leadership program I did, they talked about that there's different stages for white people of grieving the complicity that we've had in a settler kind of colonialist approach. So first it's denial, right? So some of my extended family members are in denial. And then there's guilt and shame, right? So I've been there. And then you try to bargain. Well, like if I do this, then this will happen, or I'll do that. And then you just get into deep sadness. And then finally, it's acceptance. It's acceptance of that legacy. So, on any particular day, I may be bargaining or I may be sad, and sometimes I get to the point of acceptance. But as a white woman, it's like, this has had to have been a really important part of my own self-study. And as you said, talk to people from different perspective, read different perspective, and realizing that we have to act. And I feel this way very personally, like for white people, I need this stuff. Like I need us to work on racism because this world is not what I want for my kids fundamentally. Like we need to build the democracy we need in this country, or we're not going to have that opportunity.
Jody, I think you're absolutely right. And, I think it's not democratic principles that sort of, it seems to me that there's a lot of disagreement on. People embrace the concept of liberty and justice for all, we the people being created equal. The problem is the implementation of those principles, and what does that mean? So if we're really looking at an equal society, if we're really looking at then that becomes problematic, and that becomes, and that's where I talk about, as I discussed, that's where the nervousness comes in, right? Because then people get uncomfortable, really looking at what system, how have I been privileged in this system? How have I been disadvantaged by this system? How have others been so? But you're absolutely right. These are the stages. There are stages that, and I'd say, there are stages as a society that we have to go through. I think one of the best things that's happened now is that we see a lot of attention, and I think serious action, serious consideration in the anti-racism sphere, in the racial equity sphere. If we look at philanthropic organizations and the amount of resources that they are allocating, those are very encouraging signs. But this work has to be done in season and out of season. And I think that's part of it too, is that it can't be a fading commitment. This has to be a commitment that we are tied to for the years to come.
Yeah, so this is in part what I wanted to talk about now. When I'm talking to my students, I've been saying there's obviously been a lot of happening on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
And as a student of social movements, I know that unless we change institutions and institutional practices, the things on the streets aren't going to be brought in. So you've done a lot of work around identifying formal tools that organizations can use to really try to move forward these values and these commitments that we've been discussing. So what are some ideas that you found to be helpful? I think first, like formally, and then I want to talk about the informal stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I talk a bit about a three-step process called naming, blaming, and claiming. So within an organization, naming the source of injustice, what is the issue, and let's name it, let's identify it. And then blaming in terms of where does that occur? Okay, where do we see the inequities and the disparities occurring within our organization? What policies, what unit, where is this happening? And then claiming, in the sense that we then take ownership of it and take responsibility for moving the needle. And I do think it's important that we have dashboards and benchmarks. I mean, we have to have some sort of goal in terms of where are we going? And I also think it's important that we celebrate our victories along the way. And I think that's one of the things that, and I think this is a fair criticism, that sometimes folks say, well, this work is never going to be done. Time we solve one problem, there's another problem. And yes, that is the truth. But at the same time, we have to take a moment to celebrate with our employees and with folks that are in our organizations to say, yes, we still have a lot of problems, but look at what, let's stop for a moment and see, where were we 3 years ago and where are we now? And then I think the question is, how do we determine what those goals are? What's our speed? And what is it that we're working toward, so that it does become manageable. So those are some of the, formal, you talked about the racial equity audits. I think those cultural audits, those are important, those assessments. Informally, I always say, especially to leaders and agency heads of any organization, I always think it's very important to do a very careful assessment and a very personal assessment of where you spend your time and where you spend your money. Because no matter what any of us say, whether it's an individual or an organization, those two things really indicate what our priorities and what our values actually are. So I can say all day that, yes, I'm committed to eating healthy, but let's look at what I've eaten in the past month. And, haven't had, 3 hamburgers in the past month probably doesn't suggest that my practice is aligning and my behaviors are aligning with what I say I value. Okay. And so for any organization, all organizations have some amount of discretionary resources. We know this, right? Even the slimmest of budget, there's some discretionary resources. How are those resources deployed? And how does the deployment of those resources advance racial equity? And how does that demonstrate anti-racism? The same thing about how we spend our time. As leaders of organizations, state agency heads, local government agency heads, there are several demands on agency heads' time. But you make time for budget meetings. You make time for, oftentimes I see that the DEI work gets cast off into, okay, let's hire a director of DEI. Nothing wrong with that. We need those individuals, but then that does not absolve the entire organization of their responsibility. And that responsibility remains a very important component of the leadership. So I say the first thing to do informally is to really sit back and say, am I only providing a verbal commitment to these values, promoting racial equity and being anti-racist? What does an audit of my financial spending and an audit of how I spend my time, what does that reflect? Is there congruence there, or do I see important gaps?
The other piece of that I want to just add, I agree 100%, because this DEI person feels to me very performative, right? It's like, oh yeah, they'll handle it. I think it is a lot too, like how we're set up for communication. Who do we hire, right? How do we hold people accountable? Is it in performance appraisals? So is it not only is the executive asking those questions of themselves, but are we giving people a space to reflect every time they do a performance appraisal about how they're living out those values as well? On the informal cultural stuff, I'm curious what you would say about that. I've been finding myself like really wanting to honor the authority of the position that I'm in, but also try to create a culture where I welcome questions, right? And that I pay a lot of attention to trying to create an expectation where people can lead from where they sit, right? That they can participate. They don't have to ask permission to do basic things. I've also been thinking a lot about who has access to me as an executive, and is it only people who look like me or think like me, and trying to create other pathways so that people who historically have had experience in my organization haven't been able to talk or have a relationship with the executive, and trying to decenter that a little bit, because I think that's really important in terms of, for white people, how we think about power and authority. I think this challenge is about looking at that differently. But I'm curious what you've been trying to do in, like, informally.
Right. All those things I completely agree. I mean, this goes back to, I think back to work many, many years ago, looking at informal organizations, Peter Blau's work, as who goes to lunch with whom, and, all those things send a message. And I think about it in terms of, what are the networks that exist within our organization when, who are the folks that prior to COVID saw each other on the weekend, or, and what does that look like, right? Because, their relationship building happens there. Some opportunities might happen there. And so, how do we get a hold of that? What does that look like? Because that does tell us who do we have access to, and then who has access to us. And, the other point I want to make about the DEI work too, is that in a number of organizations, the big pattern that I see is not only do we say, oh, let's let the DEI folks handle that, but then the DEI folks are completely under-resourced compared to anyone else, so it's like you're the director of DEI, and maybe perhaps you have an administrative assistant or a part-time administrative assistant, and that's it. No budget, no staff, but then you're supposed to take on all the problems of the organization. And that in and of itself is a great place for organizations to start. What are the responsibilities that I'm putting on the DEI office, and what resources am I providing to them to engage in those responsibilities? So I think that's a big area that really needs a lot of examination in organizations. And I've seen two patterns, and I don't know, Jody, I'd love to know your thoughts on this in organizations, but in agencies that I've visited, I've seen two patterns. I've seen where you really have a strong, very effective DEI person in those positions. And oftentimes they're not resourced. So they're largely a lone ranger trying to take on all of the work of the organization and catching it kind of from all ends. And then I've seen organizations, it seems, where they have intentionally hired the weakest possible person to be the DEI officer. And the idea is that the position is really not to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to really buffer the organization and to keep it from making systemic changes. And so I really think that we have to, it behooves all organizations to really take a huge look at that capacity and to see what is really there. I think that's the place where we really need to do some serious digging among public sector organizations in particular.
My teenager would say facts. What you just said is facts.
See, you're bringing me up to speed, Jody. I'm gonna have a whole another lexicon by the time I get off from your teenagers. That's good.
So, Susan, I'm gonna move to some questions from the community who's gathered here, that we can kind of weave those into our conversation, and then we're gonna in about 15 minutes turn it to people to start thinking and talking with each other about what they want to do with the seeds that we're planting in their minds. But so somebody said, and this is good for us as educators, learning at an anti-racist organization is great, and this work is deeply necessary. But how do you both see students and alumni of these programs keeping this learning and growth from happening in a fishbowl? How would you encourage people to apply anti-racist knowledge in communities, not necessarily organizations, that may be neutral on race or even actively racist?
Mm-hmm. So a few things on the, I always think that we have to start with the individual or the person in the mirror first. The individual or the organization, I'm sorry, in the mirror first. It's always very easy for us to say, and I think by nature, we say, oh, the problem is out there. We want to, instruct our students in how to work with communities, do all these kind of things. But I think it's always important for all organizations to first look inward. And that was one of the things that I liked the most about the Race and Social Justice Initiative, that it was based on the premise of let's get our own house in order first. And I do think that that's important to do. But then you asked about how, when if you have areas that are resistant, communities that are resistant, always think whatever the change is, whatever the innovative practice is, whether it's technology, anti-racism, what it is, you only have 3 groups. You've got the eager beavers. Those are the folks who were ready to do it, years ago, and just like, okay, fantastic, let's go. You've got the middle of the road folks who are, okay, this is the new initiative of the day. I'm not gonna, I wouldn't have thought of it probably. I wouldn't have been necessarily interested in doing it, but I respect the fact that this is the will of leadership and I want to do my part to advance the agenda. And then you've got the resistors. You've got those who are going to actively come up with reasons for why it cannot be done, it should not be done, and why they will not do it. And so what you have to focus on is building up the assistance and the engagement, and building out capacity among the first 2 groups. The third group, you are essentially trying to get that group as small as possible, but understanding that that group is going to exist. And one of the things that I've seen with a lot of leaders of organizations is that, especially when it comes to areas like racial equity, they're saying, well, but I still got these, 4 or 5 people who just, well, you're going to still have those 4 or 5 people, right? And so, you're going to still have those 4 or 5 people, right? But if there's a technology change, or if there's whatever, then, those folks have to get on board. In other words, you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep the organization moving forward, and you cannot allow perfect to be the enemy of good. And so you can still do good work, and you can still advance anti-racist work, but you cannot let a few individuals hold you back. And I think in the case of the folks that are neutral or negative, I think, which is the premise of the question, again, I think a lot of those neutral people are willing, especially if it's a data-driven approach, they are oftentimes more open than we anticipate. But we also have to concede the fact and be willing to accept the fact that there will be those who just simply are not going to be supportive, and that's fine.
I also think that the beginning part of the question to me was interesting. I believe it's coming from a student or younger person, because it says learning at an anti-racist organization is great and deeply necessary. And I'm like, that's like a big thing we're trying to do. Like I don't think that's a given. And I do think what I love about my conversations with young people is they are so like, we need to do this now. And of course we need to do this now. And institutional change is deep change that helps sustain when movements come, when people come out of the streets, right? So I think it is, leading and managing institutions it's slower work in some ways, except for these moments, Susan, that you're talking about, where you're in a pivot moment, right? Where you can move through that policy window of opportunity. Right. So, but it is a little bit, being willing to say, yeah, those 5 people are there, but that's not going to stop me. Another question was, how would you go about incorporating DEI in performance evaluation at multiple levels, at leadership, but also other levels in an organization?
So I think one of the things, especially for leaders, is that it starts with, of course, the work profile, right? And so we have percentages of their responsibility, and you think, 20% of your time is supposed to be spent on this. And so first of all, making sure that it is in part of the work profile that gets evaluated formally during the performance period. Then I think working with the individual employee to determine what are those goals, and what do those goals map back to? Do they map back to a larger diversity plan? What is it that they map back to? And then having specific performance indicators, especially if if you have performance indicators in other areas, such as budgeting, such as whatever the issue might be, contracting, whatever procurement, whatever those areas are, building it in, and then having accountability, because oftentimes the diversity statement is sort of the throwaway statement, but it's not threaded all the way through the performance cycle and the performance review. And then I think the other piece is giving a very honest assessment. And I think that's where oftentimes that's the most difficult part. In some ways, it's not hard putting it in. It's oftentimes hard assessing against it. And we know that performance evaluations in general tend to be inflated, but that's particularly the case in the DEI space in particular. And so where, doing one workshop or something, does that warrant an excellent? Does that warrant an outstanding? And so having some clear criteria, and perhaps I think one of the biggest tools that can happen there is to have those criteria already identified prior to the performance evaluation, so that what constitutes excellent, or what constitutes whatever the scale is. What does this look like for excellence in this space? Okay, and then to assess performance based upon the criteria, because the criteria are then clear, and in fairness to everyone, they're already established, and then pulling that thread through. And then the other thing is, of course, word gets out very quickly, right? We all know the rules of our organizations, the formal rules, but then we know the informal ones, right? The things that really matter, right? And so if people feel like, oh, well, you can do very little and you're still going to get an excellent in the DEI area, no, but when there are some honest reviews and people are getting needs improvement, or, whatever the scale is, unsatisfactory, then that sends a very strong signal that the work is being taken seriously, and that your performance in this area there is going to be accountability. And that also modifies behavior. That's on the stick side. On the carrot side, which I favor using more often, is being able to set up some awards and incentives. It doesn't cost very little to have who receives the anti-racism award for this organization this year. Is there an individual? Is there a unit? Nominating folks. And so then who gets the equity award, or what unit gets the anti-racism award? So sharing that and being able to have that work acknowledged and have it as a point of pride, I think is very important. We've seen this in our own professional associations, Jody, that I know that you and I, at APAM or ASPA, you start having these awards and things that, schools that can get the diversity award and the social equity award and the diversity across the curriculum award. And then suddenly folks are like, we need to be doing something so we can get this award, and so, that is true, and that's fine. And so putting some of those incentives in place, that's one of the best things that organizations can do. And it costs very, very little.
I really appreciate that. One of the questions that came in is, how do you protect these kinds of efforts from being just a trend? How do you sustain them? And I think you're talking about it, but I also feel like sometimes when I start talking about things like awards or performance appraisals, right, and this training, the stuff you're talking about, people who haven't spent a lot of time in organizations, their faces kind of glaze over because they're like, we want to be on the street. And it's like, yeah, we need people on the street, and we need people to be doing, it's like the machinery of the institutions and the organizations, because that's what's sustained. And this weekend I was talking to a friend who's just bought a new house, and she said, there's a website you can go to, and I shouldn't say this in front of all these people because I don't remember the website, where you can go look at the deed of your property. Mm-hmm. And you can check out whether or not there's a racial covenant that ever was held on that deed. And in the upper Midwest, where I am right now, those racial covenants prohibiting the property from being sold to people who are not people who look like me are deep and institutionalized, right? And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about going in and changing that deep stuff, the stuff that's in the details of bylaws and performance appraisal systems and committees, because that's how it's sustained, right? If you change that stuff, then we start defaulting to a different kind of reality.
Mhm.
It's not very sexy sometimes, maybe, but it's, I think, really important. Somebody asked a really powerful question. I want to ask you to reflect upon it, which is, what are strategies that can be deployed to combat the weaponization of anti-racist work?
Mm. Well, I think that always go back to, I think the best strategy is data. And I know that some folks are like, oh, please don't tell me that, right? But, I know,
You're an academic at the end,
right,
Susan.
yeah. I mean, I think that's always a great starting point, because when you have that factual data of practices, of disparities, when you have that data as a starting point, if we look at, excess deaths in the following COVID and where they have been, and we know that Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately impacted. I mean, just as an example, when you have the data as a starting point, that's always a great place to start. It's not so much, people can choose to use whatever they want to as a weapon. The question is whether it will be an effective weapon or not. And so that would really be my, again, and part of the effective weapon is, let's just get back to the data. And that's where I think organizations who are having sustained, and I know you asked about this, Jody, or having sustained commitment in this space. I have a continuum. You have the organizations that get, sort of all wrapped around the axle. There's a focusing event, or there's, a lawsuit or something. And so it causes them to be in this space. They wouldn't normally be in this space, but, they're on the front page of the newspaper. They have to do something. Or you see organizations that, so they're in the crisis, or you have folks that are just never talking about racism. It's like, we're in the great panacea here. Racism doesn't live here. Like you said, the whole denial piece. But where you want to be, where organizations want to be, is they want to be in the middle, where elements like institutional racism, structural racism, that they are being discussed, just like we would be talking about efficiency or cost benefit analysis or return on investment, where we are doing the analysis, we're accepting the data, and then we're instituting the change. And I think that is a great place for organizations to be. And it's great to get it baked in, because then it becomes much more normalized, because you're already used to thinking from a racial equity lens, and what are the implications.
So we have time for one more question before we invite people to kind of step into their own reflections about what they can do. It's again, powerful question about creating space for trust building to engage in anti-racist work, and really moving from people who are more performative or kind of checking the box to deeper engagement. And I think that this is so important because, people always say culture change happens at the pace of trust. And I feel a little bit like you have to do that, but also be clear on your expectations as a leader, that this isn't actually optional, and I think right now in the larger political environment, people have learned a lot that if they look like me and want to pull a fit and storm the Capitol, right, that's suddenly going to become the conversation, rather than dealing with the historical legacies that have been limiting the country from being what it could be, in my opinion. So I'm just curious about your own strategies for kind of creating space. We've been having a lot of team conversations about this expectation, and different teams are at different places, and trying to give some grace and really give people more permission to make mistakes, and to say they're wrong and they're sorry. But what have you been trying?
So one of the things that we've done at the Wilder School this year that that we started, and we're now about a year in, and we've already done some great work, and I can't take credit for any of it. All goes to my tremendous faculty colleagues. But we have a racial equity action plan, and we've got research, teaching, community engagement, dean's cabinet priorities, and we just said, what does this look like? What is our plan? We've got a dashboard there. We've got team leaders for each area. We put things in there and we update, and we really track our progress. And I don't think I can emphasize that enough. In too many cases, the plan is the beginning and the end. We have a plan, and then we declare victory after the plan. But accountability to the plan doesn't really occur. And I think that's one of the most important things that I've tried to do, and that I think is really important to do, is that we build in accountability, and that we hold ourselves accountable, and that we hold others accountable relative to the plan, that the plan is not the end into itself. And I even seen that, I've been working in the past couple of months with our state in the COVID vaccination efforts. And, states had wonderful, all kinds of, racial equity plans relative to COVID-19 vaccinations, but the implementation of those plans fell apart in many, many places very quickly. And so we really do have to hold ourselves accountable for implementation of the plan. And so those are some of the things that we've done through our work at the racial equity action plan. But of course, like you said, none of us has gotten this, this is a long journey. We are making progress, and we should be proud of the progress that we're making, but we can't rest on our laurels. And there's a lot more progress that needs to be made. I've been sort of up in arms about just looking at the vaccination process. We had folks in long-term care facilities. We said, go to the front of the line because you're likely to get COVID. All right, great. We had folks that were 65 and older, go to the front of the line because you're likely to get COVID. That's what the data says. Okay, great. You're in phase 1B. Then we get to Black and brown individuals. And where are Black and brown individuals on the vaccination priority plan? Well, then that's where it falls apart. So our data-driven approach that worked for those who are in long-term care facilities, who work for those who are over 65, we don't do it for Black and brown communities. And one thing I'll have to say, with the great work of some of our state colleagues in the state of Virginia, just last week when I was looking at vaccination priorities in Richmond and Henrico, we now have in policy priority individuals who are in underrepresented minority groups. And it's right there in black and white to be read, because how do you justify that you were data driven in all of these areas? And some folks will say, well, it's picked up in another area. It's a proxy. I won't get on that, but I think that having this whole notion that something else is a proxy for race is in and of itself racist, because we don't think enough of the characteristics to say that we should isolate and identify it, but we say, let's let something else serve as a proxy for this. And what we know is that there is no proxy for race.
I think we could keep talking for hours on this important topic. And we want to walk our talk at Evans, which is to say there are leaders in every chair or every Zoom room.
Absolutely.
And so I want to pass this to Rebecca to move us to the next part of our program, because we know there's insight. The chat's been going crazy as we've been talking, and insight that we want people to share with each other.
Well, thank you so much, Jody. And look, I look forward to, we have to do this East Coast, West Coast thing that we'll have to host. So I like it. We'll have you. I'm inviting you now. So
thank you.
Well,
take care, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean Gooden. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jody, for walking us through that incredible conversation. For those who've asked, yes, it will be recorded. It is being recorded, and we will be sending it out, the conversation out in a couple of hours. So I know that some folks will need to hop off here. It's the top of the hour, but if you have another 25 minutes to stay with us, we invite you to move into the next part of this conversation, which is really focused on how we do this work together. So if you can stay, we're going to give you 30 seconds to stand and stretch, refill your glass of water. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about how we will turn to the themes and lessons that we've learned and think about application within our own roles, organizations, and networks. So we'll just give you 30 seconds to stand and stretch, and then we'll be back.
Thanks again, Jody. Appreciate the opportunity, and good luck with your move too, and all the packing that you're doing. So, all right, take care.
Okay, well, we are glad for those of you who are able to stay. And like Jody said, we're going to start to think about how we can walk this talk and do this work. So while we are transitioning and giving instructions, I'm going to give you a quick head start on the first question that's going to be posed, just to start, give you the chance to start thinking about it.